Scotch has been around for so long that certain terms have changed meaning, some are kind of based in nothing, and the rest is just marketing fluff. So I'm here to earn my moniker as the Whiskey Dictionary and teach you 10 different Scotch terms that you should really know if you want to get into the hobby of drinking whiskey. Here we go. First up, let's talk about single malt. Now, this is a term that you've probably heard. However, I don't want you to confuse it with something like a single barrel, where here in the US we do crazy amount of single barrel bourbons and whatever else. It's much different. Single malt is more of a legal definition. Under the United Kingdom's Scotch whisky regulations, a single malt Scotch whisky must be made exclusively from malted barley, which is basically just barley that's been allowed to germinate. Although you can also add E150 caramel coloring, it must be distilled using pot stills at a single distillery and must be aged for at least 3 years in oak casks of a capacity not exceeding 700 liters. For example, we have Glenmorangie single malt, and then we also have some Ardbeg single malt. This one's the Hypernova, but I have more Ardbegs than I can count back there. These are things that are kind of designed to showcase what that distillery can do. And it's really like, this is what we love. This is really good. Make this just its own bottle. And that's single malt. It's a way to showcase what the distillery can do. Next, we have cask finishing. Now, cask finishing is a very easy concept to understand. You basically have your whiskey that you've created, and you're putting it into your ex-bourbon barrel, most likely, and you're going to just let it sit there for, say, 11 years. Now you're going to take that whiskey and you're going to transfer it into an ex-sherry cask, or rum, or Madeira, or Chardonnay. I've actually seen once, which wasn't very good. Oof. Nah. And you're going to let it sit there for like a year. Now you have a 12-year-old whiskey, which has been finished in sherry or whatever. So that's the idea. You're finishing whiskey. So something that came up recently, this has recently entered my collection, is the Offerman Edition Caribbean Rum Cask. Now this is actually a very, very good whiskey, especially if you like Lagavulin. So definitely check this one out. But the idea is this spent 10 years and 4 months, something like that, in an ex-bourbon barrel, and then it spent 8 months in a rum cask, and now they can sell it as an 11-year whiskey. So this is a very good one, check it out, but that's the idea. The next one is a dram. Now you've heard a lot of us talk about how we're going to have a wee dram of whiskey or whatever. A dram, just historically, is about 1/8 of an ounce. That's probably even too much. And that doesn't feel like very much to me. But if you're doing some sort of a flight of whiskey or whatever, that might be a good amount to pour just so you get an idea and you could taste it. But if somebody's telling you that they want to have a wee dram, that's really a very small amount of whiskey. However, just colloquially, we often will just say that for a pour of whiskey. So if somebody offers you a dram, you're probably not going to get like the tiny little bit. You're probably just going to get a glass of whiskey. E150 or caramel coloring is basically food coloring for your whiskey. And the idea is kind of controversial, especially when it comes to Scotch, but this is kind of all over the place. If you're appealing to a higher end market, we don't want to see that. On the back of our bottles, we want to say no color added, non-chill filtered. But in the case of non-color added, that means that you did not put the E150. And it's not illegal to do that. So why would a distillery want to do this? Well, for the most part, they're targeting a certain audience. They are targeting people who want to see every bottle on the shelf look identical. And despite the fact that you're making an organic product, you want every bottle to look the same, because if one of the bottles is lighter than the rest, maybe that person's like, oh, that's weird, that one's lighter. And maybe it was like in the sun, or maybe it's gone bad because I don't really know anything about whiskey. So let me give you an example. So Bruichladdich here, this is the Bruichladdich 18. This is non-colored. There's no color added. It's kind of like this dull brown color, which is totally fine. But if I put this next to another bottle, it would probably look slightly different. Now here's another example. This is Dalmore. Now Dalmore is known for using E150. And by the way, Johnny Walker does too. There's a bunch of places that do. But Dalmore, in maybe 10 years ago, kind of went through a thing where everybody realized that they were coloring their whiskey, and I don't know that they were being super transparent about it. And a lot of people turned on Dalmore. And that is something that happens when you're not honest in the whiskey industry. So in the case of this is sherry finish, so it's going to have that reddish hue to it, but when you add the coloring as well to make everything look the same, I mean, this is practically neon brown. So E150 is fine if that's what you're going for. Some people can claim that they can taste it. I would challenge them to prove that. Maybe like 1 in a million people could really prove that, but whatever. Let's move on. First fill versus refill. Now, you've probably heard me talk about a first fill or a second fill bourbon barrel on this channel before, or maybe somebody else, whatever. But the idea is in the US, follow me here. So in the US, we make our whiskey, and we make it and we utilize a brand new oak cask. After we've made whiskey and we've drained that cask and then we've bottled it, whatever, we can't reuse that barrel. We have to send that somewhere else. Now, maybe an American single malt could or something like that, but like our bourbon barrels cannot be reused. So we either send those to a brewery or we send them overseas, a lot of times Scotland. Now, Scotland has that first fill ex-bourbon barrel because they're doing the first fill after it was not a bourbon barrel anymore. And then they age it, and maybe let's even say they go over and they finish it in sherry Scotch. They still have this barrel. However, now it's going to be second fill. And then it's going to be third fill, fourth fill, etc., etc. They can reuse that cask as long as they see value in it. Now, casks will deteriorate over time. They'll also just become old. And casks are not very expensive when you're dealing with the volume and whatever that whiskey industries are doing. So they're going to want to get as much flavor out of that as they possibly can. You're going to get flavor the first fill, the second fill, maybe some on the third fill. Past that, you're really just storing whiskey. But here's where the kicker is. If you talk about a sherry cask, now one of the dirty secrets of the whiskey industry is that sherry cask is coming over. A lot of times there's something sloshing around in there. It's not just in the wood. You actually can have a certain amount of, say, sherry left in that cask and still have it be legally Scotch whiskey. So you want that because it's giving a lot of flavor. But after you're using that the second time, all of that stuff that was sloshing around is no longer there. And you can reuse it the second time, but you're losing a lot of flavor in that case. That's what a refill and first fill cask are. Floor malting is a very traditional process for germinating barley. And the idea is that you are covering your floor with all of this barley and maybe steaming the room. There's a couple of different ways to do it. But let's just say you're pouring steam into the room so that it's warm and it's wet. And these seeds are kind of prompted to grow. But the problem is that as they grow, the roots are going to come out of the seed and they'll start kind of twisting together. And then you get these clumps of barley. You do not want that. That's bad. So what they do is they have these specialty tools. They're basically shovels, but they're a little slotted, whatever. And the people just kind of shovel it like snow. And they lift it, turn it, flop it. Should lift it, whatever. But this is something that is not done very traditionally because at this point, machines have kind of made that irrelevant. However, us whiskey snobs, we like things traditional, and the Balvenie kind of has our back here. They're one of the few distilleries that still do this. Now, there's a funny little thing that you've probably heard of, the term monkey shoulder. Now, monkey shoulder is an injury that people would get because they're doing a repetitive task over and over and over again, and eventually they would sprain their shoulders. And over time, that would become a real injury, and their arm would kind of hang lower than it normally would. And the idea is it kind of looks like you look like a monkey or an ape, right? So that's where that term comes from. If you're enjoying the video, remember to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I have a whole lot of these kind of informational videos, probably more than any other whiskey tuber, really. So if you're really looking to learn about whiskey, this is the channel to be. But let's talk about mash tuns. A mash tun is a very simple concept. You have a big vat that you have all of your germinating barley and you pour hot water into it. And what that does is it breaks down some of the sugars and it adds them to the water. You are then now going to add your yeast to that and you're going to ferment it. And that's kind of how you make what's called wort, which is basically the start of whiskey. Terroir refers to the environmental factors that go into making whiskey. So this is basically like your microbiome, but it also has to do with all of the ingredients that are going in. Where are they grown? What were the conditions that they were grown? You'll see this a lot in winemaking, and that's actually kind of where the term comes from, but it also applies to whiskey. So if you want to think of something, I don't want to use something as drastic as Islay because at that point you're using peat and that has a whole different thing, but let's just talk the lowlands versus the highlands. Or if you're making your whiskey near the ocean, like that's your terroir, that's your location, that's everything going into your whiskey other than just the grains, which are also part of the terroir. So that's what it means. If you hear about people talking about terroir, they're talking about the environment that that whiskey came from and all of the stuff that went into that whiskey. Now let's talk about peat and ppm. Now my favorite kind of whiskey is heavily peated, very smoky whiskey. I like everything else too, but that's one of my favorites. And when you're talking about peat, what you're talking about is decomposed plant matter. Now this could either be, it could be a few different things. Usually you think of things like heather being one of the major factors in making peat, but you also think about maritime stuff. So like where there were bogs or where there used to be part of the ocean or something like that. And you're going to have a little bit of a different flavor from this, but let me kind of back up a little bit. Peat are cut up bricks of this decomposing matter. What these are used for is to dry out that germinating barley. But in the process of creating the smoke that ends up doing this, you're also imparting some of that smoky flavor into your whiskey. And that's why whiskeys from Islay are typically smoky, is because that's usually how they're heating up and stopping the germination of the barley. So, in the case of something like the Octomore, which some of you might have known this was coming out, this is a 90.3 ppm, and that means phenol parts per million. And you can think about this if you're into eating really spicy food. This is basically your Scoville units of smoke. So a really high one, like 100 or 90, whatever, that's pretty darn high. Some of the stuff that you've tasted and probably turned your nose at were probably closer to like 30. So this one's really, really smoky. Now, some of the ones I've tried higher than this, and they're all just fantastic to me, but not for everybody. So if you hear about peat or ppm, just know that you're talking about a smoky characteristic to your whiskey. When we're talking about the heads and the tails, we're talking about our distillation. So as we're distilling, we are boiling that alcohol. Everything that we've been making, we're boiling it. And if you remember chemistry, different elements and compounds are going to evaporate at different temperatures. So as we're starting to boil it, certain things are going to start floating up, and they're not going to be the alcohol that you really want. It's going to be the head. Now, in the head are going to be things like methanol or acetaldehyde or acetone. These are things that you don't really want to have, and in certain quantities could actually be lethal, which obviously they're not going to put out there. But these heads are kind of stripped off, they're sent a different way, and then you have what comes next. This is the heart of the distillate. This is the part that you want. This is where everybody's happy and the angels are singing and you're making whiskey. Then after that's done, you're kind of tasting this or maybe watching it. Like people who really know what they're doing, they can time this stuff. They can figure it out. But then you have the tail. Now this tail, this has some of the heavier elements. These are going to be things like sulfur or propyl alcohol or fatty acids. All of these things are sitting in the tail and they are not great. You don't want them. They're going to give really bad flavor to your whiskey. And you can tell this. Sometimes I've had whiskeys where I'm like, oh man, they didn't cut this right. And you can just tell immediately. So all those heads and tails are not necessarily wasted, because what you can do is you can actually redistill that along with just kind of another batch, or some places will actually distill multiple times. And the idea is that there is still some alcohol kind of where you cut, and you might have lost some of it. So if you do it again, you'll reduce the amount of waste, and that's a good thing for a business. So heads and tails. Well, I hope that this one's helped. I know not everybody just naturally knows about Scotch. We kind of grow up hearing a little bit more about bourbon than we necessarily do Scotch, or maybe it seems a little like something we can't touch because it's all very expensive. But I hope you learned a little something. I'm going to have myself a Dram, and that's probably about 3/8. But either way, I want to say cheers to all of you. Good luck. Go buy yourself a Scotch and have a great rest of your day. Cheers. Where'd it go?